President Putin of Russia has reportedly ordered government intelligence agencies to undermine the EU from within. This means making people unable to trust each other, causing allies to fight among themselves, and dividing society. It shows that Russia's hybrid operations are already being carried out on a wide scale. According to a report by the New York Times, President Putin of Russia has ordered Russian government intelligence agencies and the military to destroy NATO and the EU from within by 2026. Among these, Moldova has emerged as a key target of the Kremlin's strategy. First, let's look at what orders Russia has given. President Putin of Russia has issued two orders. One is to test the defensive resolve of NATO member states, and the other is to destabilize Moldova. First, let's see what it means to test the defensive resolve of NATO member states. By its nature, NATO requires that if any one country is attacked, all NATO member states must intervene. This serves as a very strong deterrent to war, but since it relies on trust, if a war breaks out and certain countries do not intervene, there is a very high possibility that the alliance could collapse. So, Russia is attacking or conducting operations in various neighboring countries to break NATO's unity. In fact, US government officials have assessed that, as early as this fall, Russia may try to test NATO's resolve by launching small-scale attacks against NATO countries. Right now, Russian drones are frequently violating the airspace of the three Baltic states and Romania. This also appears to be an attempt to test NATO's resolve. But since I already covered this in a previous video, it would be good if you watched that video. This time, according to a New York Times report, there was information about Moldova. It would be good to take a look at this. Currently, Russia's strategic goal seems to go beyond just gaining political influence over Moldova, and is actually trying to turn Moldova into a completely pro-Russian country. In Moldova, there is Transnistria, which is a place where Russian troops have been stationed for decades. It's also a place controlled by pro-Russian forces, similar to how pro-Russian forces were active in Donbas, Ukraine back in 2014. However, you might have some questions about this. Even in southern Ukraine, the Russian military hasn't been able to advance as much as they want, so there's a question of whether Russia can really take control of Moldova like this. In fact, even without a large-scale invasion of mainland Moldova, Russia already has ways to put pressure on them. The key is Transnistria. In eastern Moldova and Transnistria, Russian troops have been stationed for a long time, and pro-Russian separatist forces are effectively in control. For Russia, this region can be used to continuously apply military and political pressure on Moldova. Therefore, it's not necessarily the case that Russia must break through southern Ukraine and deploy large ground forces to take control of all of Moldova. In addition, the connection between Ukraine and Moldova is also an important factor. In March 2026, an attack by Russian forces on a Ukrainian hydroelectric power plant caused an oil spill in the Dniester River, and as the contaminated water flowed toward Moldova, several regions in Moldova experienced disruptions in their drinking water supply. As areas including Moldova's third largest city were affected, it became clear that military operations targeting Ukraine could also directly damage Moldova's basic infrastructure. A similar problem occurs in the power sector. When Russian forces attacked high-voltage transmission facilities in western Ukraine, the power grid supplying electricity to Moldova was affected, and at one point, 70% of Moldova's power supply was knocked out. The reason this situation is important is because Moldova's energy and infrastructure are closely connected with Ukraine. Even if Russia does not directly attack Moldova, Ukraine, in the process of attacking Ukraine's key facilities, Moldova's electricity and water supply can be affected. Moldova has found itself in a situation where it suffers from the consequences of the war in Ukraine, even though it is not directly at war with Russia. On top of this, political pressure is also increasing. Russia is utilizing pro-Russian forces and political networks within Moldova, intervening in elections, and providing financial support. There are suspicions that Russia is carrying out various operations such as spreading false information to increase distrust toward the pro-European government. Moldova is pushing for EU membership, but if domestic politics continue to be divided between pro-Russian and pro-European forces, the political burden on the accession process will inevitably increase. This is because joining the EU requires not only legal and institutional reforms, but also political stability and continuity of reforms. Therefore, it is difficult to explain Russia's pressure on Moldova with just a single military operation. The key point is that Russia can simultaneously utilize its existing military base in Transnistria, infrastructure for electricity and water connected to Ukraine, and internal political conflicts within Moldova. Even if Russia does not deploy large-scale troops across the Moldovan border, the conditions are already in place for it to continuously undermine Moldova's political, economic, and social stability. On top of that, Russia continues to interfere in Moldova's elections. Russian hackers have even tried to hack into Moldova's Central Election Commission system to manipulate votes. So, we need to look at why Russia is targeting Moldova. First of all, Moldova is not a NATO member country, nor is it a member of the European Union. Therefore, if Russia pressures or attacks Moldova, NATO's collective defense will not be automatically triggered. However, if a military conflict breaks out in Moldova, the security burden on the same countries could change significantly. Especially since Romania, which shares a border with Moldova, is a NATO member, it is difficult to separate Moldova's situation from its own security. The relationship between Moldova and Romania is also an important factor. The two countries have they have close cultural ties, and currently there are opinions within Moldova that support unification with Romania. Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, also expressed in an interview with the British podcast The Last is Politics on January 11, 2026, that she would support unification with Romania if a national referendum were held. Of course, this does not mean that the unification of the two countries will be pursued immediately, but it is important to note that if Russia tries to take control of Moldova or turn it in a pro-Russian direction, Romania is likely to see this as a serious security issue. This could lead to differences of opinion between Romania and other NATO members. Countries that are geographically close to Russia, such as Romania, Poland, and the Baltic states, are likely to see Russia's expanding influence over Moldova as a direct security threat. In these countries, there may be arguments that stronger measures are needed to prevent further military actions by Russia. On the other hand, Western European countries may take the position that, since Moldova is not a NATO member, they should avoid direct military confrontation with Russia. If this happens, there could be disagreements within NATO and the EU about the level of response. Eastern European countries may demand military action and additional defense reinforcement to counter Russia's threat, while Western Europe may seek diplomatic solutions to prevent escalation and argue for a more limited response. For Russia, not only the pressure on Moldova itself, but also the emergence of such political debates holds strategic significance. In fact, similar tensions are already emerging between Russia and Europe over hybrid warfare, such as drone and cyber attacks. Eastern European countries are demanding a strong response, but in Western Europe, there is caution about escalating into a direct military conflict with Russia. If a military crisis occurs in Moldova, these differences in perspective could become even more pronounced. If what Russia is aiming for is not the physical dismantling of NATO and the European Union, but rather weakening the resolve among member states, then Moldova becomes a very important area. As the crisis surrounding Moldova grows, the difference in threat perception between Eastern and Western Europe could widen, and in this process, the debate over whether to continue supporting Ukraine could also intensify again. The biggest effect Russia can hope for is a situation where Europe is unable to respond with one voice, and a significant result that could occur in that process is a reduction in military and economic support for Ukraine. And there's one more thing we need to consider here. Even if Russia fails to completely take control of Moldova, it doesn't mean the Kremlin gains nothing. On the contrary, just by keeping Moldova in a state of ongoing instability, Russia can secure considerable strategic benefits. If political turmoil continues in Moldova, the EU will have to invest more resources to maintain Moldova's economic and political stability. Western support is also needed to strengthen the capacity of government agencies and judicial institutions so that the Moldovan government can respond to Russia's operations. If this happens, Europe will find itself in a situation where it has to manage Moldova's internal stability while also responding to the war in Ukraine and the threat from Russia. Romania will also inevitably face a greater burden. Sharing a border with Moldova, Romania must consider not only the influx of refugees and border security issues, but also power outages, cyber attacks, and even military tension. The longer Moldova's instability continues, the more Romania will have to strengthen its own air defense system and border surveillance capabilities, and it may also request more deployment of NATO troops and surveillance assets. This means that Romania, along with other countries on NATO's eastern flank, will have to use more military resources to monitor Russia's movements. Naturally, this will affect Ukraine as well. Ukraine will have to keep monitoring the situation in Moldova to the west while fighting a war with Russia at the same time. If instability within Moldova increases, Ukraine will have to strengthen surveillance and intelligence gathering along the border and also continue to prepare for how Russia might use Transnistria. There's a possibility that some of the intelligence and military resources Ukraine needs to use on the front lines will have to be diverted to manage the situation in the west. From this perspective, the outcome Russia wants in Moldova doesn't necessarily have to be territorial occupation. If Moldova remains unstable, Europe will have to keep managing the issue, neighboring countries will have to strengthen their defenses, and Ukraine will have to take on additional security burdens. Russia can continuously tie up Europe's manpower, resources, and political attention in a specific region at a relatively limited cost. Therefore, when looking at Russia's strategy regarding Moldova, we shouldn't just focus on when Russia might occupy Moldova, but also on how long Russia can keep Moldova unstable. Even if Russia does not achieve a complete victory in Moldova, if it forces the West to keep paying the cost of responding, that in itself can be a strategic achievement for Russia.